We're going to read some The New History of Kentucky by Klotter, by Harrison and Klotter. Klotter's the one that brandished his name at the museum, the Kentucky Historical Museum in Frankfort. So yeah. So New History of Kentucky. In this book, which is the definitive book, this is the book that Gerald Neal used in my Kentucky history class. It's also the it's just a definitive book. It's the book that's in all the history courses in all the high schools or 4th grade. I think you learn some Kentucky history, and this is the book that they use. They have other books that he uses too, but this is the one that it's new history, right? So it's a new history. It's new and exciting. It's copyrighted in 1997 by the University Press of Kentucky. So 15 years old, but it's all still relevant today. So, Klotter, A New History of Kentucky. Okay. In this book, he says that there was no permanent hunting ground. So it actually contradicts this other book that I have called The Shawnee by Jerry Clark. So The Shawnee by Jerry Clark, he maintains that the Shawnee were living in Kentucky as permanent settlements. Now, they didn't live the way Europeans lived. During the summer, they had crops, so they would have permanent spot to stay during the summer months. But then in the winter months, they were chasing deer and buffalo and turkey. So since they were chasing deer, buffalo, and turkey during the winter months, they didn't stay in one spot. They used all of Kentucky. There was countless bands that were attacking Fort Boonesboro. Daniel Boone had 2 sons die. When Daniel Boone first went into Kentucky, they said, "Don't come in here." The Shawnee did. They killed one of his sons. I want to say James. James Boone got shot, and then Daniel Boone pulled out. And then later on, another son, Israel, got shot at the Battle of Blue Lick. So Daniel Boone lost 2 sons due to his imperialistic land-grabbing notions. So I want to read a couple of passages out of Klotter's New History of Kentucky, because he's kind of contradicting himself, saying that there was there's no Kentuckians, no Indians were living in Kentucky. It was just this vast, empty space of wilderness that white people could come and just claim, and it was just theirs, and they get to keep it, which is horse shit. It's total bullshit. That's an apologist perspective that allows white people to feel as though they came to Kentucky and there was nobody here. Well, there's ancient culture, there's serpent mounds, there's mounds all over, serpent mounds in Ohio, but there's plenty of mounds just like that here in Kentucky. The exact meaning of the word Kentucky is not known. The term may have been a Wyandot word meaning land of tomorrow, or an Iroquoian word that could be translated as place of meadows. It does not mean dark and bloody ground. So that's Klotter's position. Kentucky's not dark and bloody, and there were no Indians here to begin with. That legend probably came from the remarks made by Cherokee chiefs Dragon Canoe and Okanastota. So the Cherokee chiefs Dragon Canoe and Okanastota at Sycamore Shoals, where Richard Henderson bought the rights of the Cherokee, had to a large part of Kentucky. Dragon Canoe reportedly warned that there's a dark cloud over the country. It's a dark and bloody spot. It's a dark and bloody area. And Okanastota said to Daniel Boone, as a parted brother, "We have given you a fine land, but I believe that you will have much trouble settling it." And both of them spoke truth. So that was Okanastota, and Dragon Canoe, Okanastota. So the very meaning of the name of Kentucky, just like Michigan, Iowa, Missouri, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Illinois, Indiana. Indiana straight up means land of Indians. the land of Indians, the land where genocide happened, the land that Indians used to have, used to own. That's why when you drive through Indiana, it just sounds eerie. That's where they get Erie, Indiana from. It's eerie because there's an entire genocide that happens and nobody ever says anything about it. Talks about the different late prehistoric era. They're going on about the, what do they call it? The Paleo, the Archaic period, the Paleo-Indian period, the Woodland period, and the late prehistoric. The late prehistoric era is 1000 to 1750. So the late prehistoric era is the one that's right here at the last of the modern era. So this is like when we acknowledge that Indians were here, but then they all left in 1752 or 1754. But so the late prehistoric era was an eventful time in the story of the people who inhabited Kentucky. Corn was introduced perhaps from South America via Mexico around the beginning of this era, and it soon become the ideal wilderness crop, easy to raise, gather, and store. Beans were also introduced from Mexico, and the hoe became a common tool. The introduction of corn, beans, and other crops increased the demand for arable land in villages, which were more likely to become permanent than in the previous eras. Tribes and chieftains became more significant. People often built stockades for protection. Hunting continued to be important, with deer as the main source of meat, and the use of practical bows and arrows made hunting easier. A Mississippian culture, and this is, I think, some of the most important stuff, because the Mississippian culture developed in western Kentucky and the surrounding area, while Fort Ancient culture dominated in the eastern part of what became Kentucky. So in the western area, you have a Mississippian culture. The western area, the western Chickasaw lands, the so-called Jackson Purchase, fuck Jackson Purchase, it's the Chickasaw lands. Those lands are the Chickasaw, that's where the Chickasaw were at. So that's the Mississippian culture, was the Chickasaws. So that's where, at least that's where the they had, I don't know, when you take the gauntlet, when you take the torch, when you move the torch on, they're either the ancestors of that culture, or they were the people who took over that area after those folks had gone. So while many people think that the Fort Ancient culture is a Shawnee culture, which is an eastern part, and there's similarities between the Mississippi culture and Fort Ancient culture, while the two cultures displayed a number of similarities, the temple mounds and the chief's houses common in the Mississippi culture were lacking in the Fort Ancient. So in the Mississippi culture, there's temple mounds, right? There's mounds, temple mounds. And there's a mound in Montgomery County. It's about 9.5 meters high, and it was found 1930s. But there's temple mounds, I guess like Serpent Mound, temple mounds, and then there's chief houses. So that you actually saw the chief's houses in the Mississippi culture, and none in the Fort Ancient culture. And if it's the Shawnee are permanent settlers in the summer and nomads in the winter. So the Shawnee, who struggled with the Kentucky settlers more than any other tribe, probably numbered no more than 3,000 or 4,000 by 1750. 1750, that's the last day of the late prehistoric era, right? And Klotter saying, well, you know, there's probably some Shawnee in Kentucky, but it was only 3,000 or 4,000. Just 3,000 or 4,000 people were living there, you know, which actually makes, how many people was in Kentucky in like 1776? It was like laughable. It was like 100 people in Kentucky during 1776. He estimated that stations on or near Beargrass Creek contained at least 600 men. So that's 1780. In 1780 there were 600 white men here. So since 1780 there was white people here, that was considered real people, right? But the 3,000 or 4,000 people that was here in 1750 are not considered real people. Pushed by the aggressive Iroquois, the Shawnee moved over much of the southeastern United States before the first permanent white settlements were established in Kentucky. The Indians viewed the land as being held in common and used for the good of all. They were horrified and alarmed when the pioneers claimed individual ownership and began to build cabins, erect fences, and plow the land. If the whites were successful, the traditional communal use of the land would be gone forever. Treaties also didn't have the same meaning between the two parties. To the Indians, having permission to use a territory was not the same as possessing it. In the 1768 Treaty of Fort Stanwix, the Six Nations agreed that the Ohio River from Fort Pitt to the Tennessee River would be part of their boundary. As the whites interpreted this agreement, the treaty meant that the Indian title to Kentucky had been extinguished, except for the area west of the Tennessee River. That belief was not shared by several tribes. The Cherokee made several treaties, notably the Treaty of Hard Labor and the Treaty of Lochaber, 1770, which pushed the boundary of Virginia westward to whatever. It's treaty, so white people lied about that shit anyways. The last known Indian town in Kentucky is Skippakithekee, which is present-day Clark County. And it had a population that reached a peak of 800 to 1,000. So there's 3,000 or 4,000 people in 1750, and then Skippakithekee in Clark County had 800 to 1,000 people living there. So it's a, it's a stronghold also. So let's see. Skippakithekee, Clark County, the town was protected by a stout stockade some 200 yards in diameter. It was surrounded by 3,500 acres of land that had been cleared for crops before trader John Finley visited the Shawnee stronghold in 1752. So Skippakittekee's doing well and fine. Then all of a sudden, John Finley stopped by in 1752. And then, for reasons that remain obscure, the town was abandoned afterwards. They just picked up and left. They just took off. They just said, fuck this town. I mean, they could have, like during the winter, I guess there is that, the Shawnees lifestyle. But I think it's more likely that something happened to them. Something was done to them. Here's the Indians who's establishing themselves in this world, and it's scaring the shit out of the whites. So the whites have to make sure they wipe them out. That's what I think happened in Skippakithekee. I'm not for sure, but so this is the reason why they said that there's no permanent Indian settlements except for one or two possible minor exceptions. A number of tribes continued to use the land, however, sometimes setting up hunting camps that might remain fixed for months at a time. The early white settlers encountered members of at least a dozen tribes, so there's at least a dozen tribes here. This is Klotter. Klotter's admitting all this. He knows that there's the mounds, the temple mounds, the burial mounds, the Mississippian culture, the Fort Ancient culture. He knows about the Algonquin-speaking ancestors of the Shawnee apparently lived in Kentucky, usually in villages of a few hundred inhabitants for a considerable period. But then he goes on and says that they were pushed out. So again, he's got the same, kind of the same, I don't know, there's I think Gist or Walker, one of them older historians, was saying that there's Iroquois in the north of Kentucky and then there's the Cherokees in the south, and he's saying the same thing. You got the Shawnee north of the Ohio River, the Cherokee in the southeast, and then the Chickasaw from the southwest. So those are the three main tribes that Klotter, what's his name? Thomas Klotter? Paul Klotter? James C. Klotter. That's what Klotter says, and Lowell Harrison. So the Algonquin speaking ancestors of Kentucky, yeah, fuck.